When individuals become a group, a few things change. We develop shared identities, we have emerging norms, and accountability shifts. And that alone changes our individual thoughts, behaviors, and experiences with the group. But today, our question builds on that idea because once a group forms, differences between us start to matter in new ways. Most people agree that difference and diversity are valuable, and at the same time, many of us have been in diverse groups that feel slower or messier or harder to coordinate. So what's really going on there? I'm Professor Bailey. I have a Ph.D. in organizational communication, and this is Everyday Organizational Behavior. Today, we're asking, what changes in groups when meaningful difference is present? A first thing is that our demands change, both cognitive and communicative demands. When group members have meaningful difference, they don't always understand one another as easily, especially at first. Difference can disrupt our shared mental models and increase coordination demands. Shared mental models are overlapping assumptions about how work is done, what matters, and how people are expected to behave. These mental models help groups coordinate with less explicit communication. Research on shared mental models, particularly by Janice Cannon-Bowers, Eduardo Salas, and Sherilyn Converse, suggests that when group members have similar backgrounds or experiences, these shared understandings tend to form quickly. When group members differ in training, perspective, or experience, our shared mental models are often weaker at first and require more time and communication to develop. Related work, often referred to as the information and decision-making perspective, suggests that diverse groups may have access to broader ranges of information and viewpoints. At the same time, though, they often face higher coordination and communication demands because assumptions are less shared. I've felt this in everyday group situations, where nothing is explicitly wrong, but you suddenly realize that you can't assume everyone is interpreting things in the same way that you are or that I am. So difference doesn't just add new ideas, it changes how much explanation, clarification, and sense-making that groups have to do together, especially early on. This is where difference and diversity's potential value comes from, but it's also where groups can start to feel slower or more effortful at first. A second thing that difference in groups can change is how identity operates inside the group. Particularly what changes is how salient social categorization and subgroup formation become inside the group. This idea comes from social categorization theory, which grew out of the work of Henry Teifel and John Turner. Their research suggests that when people are navigating complex social situations and environments, they naturally rely on categories, social categories, to make sense of those environments. When groups include meaningful differences, those differences become more noticeable, especially under pressure and uncertainty or when we have time constraints. The categorization isn't intentional or malicious, it's a sense-making shortcut. Once categories become important, people may be more likely to experience the group in terms of subgroups rather than a single unified whole. Dora Lau and Keith Murnaghan's fault line theory builds on this idea by suggesting that when multiple attributes such as role, background, or identity align, groups may be more likely to split into these subgroups. Importantly, the presence of diversity alone doesn't create the fault lines. Fault lines are more likely to matter when differences align in reinforcing ways. You can see this in really ordinary situations at work. A project team where new employees cluster together while more tenured employees rely on each other, a cross-functional team where engineers tend to align with engineers and marketing tends to align with marketing, or a group with remote workers who interact more with each other than with their in-person colleagues. None of these divisions are inherently problematic, they're often practical and familiar. But when the fault lines become rigid, they can affect trust and communication and coordination, especially if people begin interpreting disagreement through these subgroup boundaries rather than based on the task needs. Fault lines don't require conflict to exist. They reflect how groups manage difference, and whether they help or hurt depends heavily on the context, the norms, and the leadership of the group. The third thing that meaningful difference in groups can change is the pathways through which conflict can emerge. Rather than saying diverse groups experience more conflict overall, research tends to point to a more nuanced pattern. Difference can introduce more dimensions along which misunderstandings, disagreements, or misinterpretations can occur. One way to think about this is that difference increases a group's complexity. When people share similar backgrounds, assumptions, and communication styles, there are just fewer dimensions along which misunderstandings can occur. Conflict can still happen, but it tends to follow more predictable paths. When groups include meaningful differences, there are simply more moving parts. Differences in perspective, communication style, norms, expectations. It can all create more opportunities for friction, sometimes around the task, sometimes around relationships. Research can help us by distinguishing between task conflict and relationship conflict. Task conflict involves differences in ideas about our approaches to work, while relationship has to do with our interpersonal tensions and often our emotions among each other. Studies suggest that groups with greater informational or functional diversity are more likely to experience task-related disagreement. At the same time, though, research also suggests that certain forms of diversity, especially demographic diversity, can be associated with higher levels of relationship conflict too, under some conditions. This matters because meta-analytic work by DeDrew and Weingart shows that relationship conflict is generally associated with more poor group outcomes. Importantly, research does not suggest that task conflict automatically turns into relationship conflict. Instead, studies seem to indicate that the interpretation of disagreement matters. Differences in communication style or expectations may be interpreted as personal or relational when shared mental models are weak or when norms for disagreement are unclear. Taken together, research suggests that difference does not determine whether conflict will occur, but rather how it's triggered, how it's interpreted, and how it unfolds, depending on the group's context and design. And whether the added complexity becomes an asset or a liability depends heavily on how the group is structured and led. So rather than asking whether meaningful difference is good or bad, or whether diversity is good or bad for groups, research encourages us to ask a more precise question: what conditions help groups manage the additional complexity that's present when we have meaningful differences among our group members?